I thought a lot and worried a lot about writing about a region that I wasn't from, writing about a region in Appalachia that has been not always treated well or with respect. And similarly, I had apprehensions about writing about addiction because that is also a stigmatized and disrespected community. I approached the victim stories the way I did for many reasons. One, I think we talked at the beginning of why did I feel this was a story, given so many of the existing stories about the opiate epidemic that was worth telling, was because at this point, decades into this crisis, we have all become overwhelmed by the death tolls, the state death tolls, the annual death tolls. They're in the hundreds of thousands. And the opportunity or the occasion to tell the stories of 10, 11, 12 people allowed me to put a face on those overwhelming death tolls.
That's Philip Eil, a journalist and the author of Prescription for Pain: How a Once Promising Doctor Became the Pill Mill Killer. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. For years, the medical community was derided for not paying attention to the pain of patients. Inspired by calls to improve pain assessment and treatment, in the 1990s, the American Medical Association began to adopt an approach and standards for pain relief. As soon as that happened, the familiar charts with different colors and different types of faces were created that now hang in doctors' offices. It was known as the fifth vital sign, right beside body temperature, heart rate, breathing rate, and blood pressure. But unlike those, pain can only be measured by a patient's estimation of the level of or based on the type of pain they're feeling. Pain management clinics began sprouting up for people who had intractable pain that all other medical interventions were not adequately addressing. Soon there were more and more of them, even cash-based ones, that took no insurance at all and that were often not even owned by doctors. Pharmaceutical companies like the Sackler family's Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin, took advantage of it by pushing their pain pills far and wide and encouraging and incentivizing doctors to use them. Around that same time, as drug markets were changing in South America and Mexico, a group of families and farmers in Baja began growing opioids that would be shipped into the United States in a new model of drug dealing that was harder for law enforcement to combat. These are many of the factors that contributed to America's opioid epidemic, which some estimate has led to millions of deaths and untold numbers of life-derailing addictions. In this maelstrom, there are many who took advantage of the opportunity. Business people, whether they were doctors or not, who opened pain clinics. The American medical system has brakes that are meant to prevent these pill mills from spinning out of control. Pharmacists often notice unusual prescriptions or prescribing patterns and can refuse to fill them when they're concerned. State medical boards have prescription monitoring systems that can catch doctors doing unusual things or patients who are doctor shopping or receiving strange dosing. But medical boards have always been known to defer to physicians in a way that does not happen with, let's say, nurses. And these creative business people found ways to work around the system. One of those doctors was a physician who obtained his MD and PhD named Paul Volkman. He graduated from the prestigious University of Chicago He employed armed guards, operated around state lines, accepting only cash, and started dispensing a flood of prescription opioid painkillers and other controlled substances. Of the many number of doctors convicted for running pill mills, Volkman received the toughest sentence, 4 consecutive life terms. At trial, he was linked to at least 14 deaths. His story and the story of the epidemic is told by Philip Eil, an award-winning journalist based in Providence, Rhode Island. Philip is the former editor of the Providence Phoenix Alternative Weekly newspaper and has contributed to magazines like The Atlantic, Nation, Men's Health, and publications like the Boston Globe, the Huffington Post, and the Columbia Journalism Review. After reading Sam Kiona's Dreamland, I never ever thought I would need to read another book on the opioid epidemic. But I was wrong. Philip's book was an excellent exploration. Today, Philip joins me to discuss Volkman's case, the impact on the area in Appalachia where he operated, and the lessons that we can learn from the opioid epidemic. Hey, Philip, thanks for joining me today. I wanted to tell you really quickly about how I came across your book. Even though I was done with books on the opioid crisis, one day Brett Talley from the Prosecutors Podcast messages me late at night and he's like, oh, you should really have this guy on your podcast. And, I picked up your book, and I have to tell you, I had a little bit of trepidation in the beginning because I've read so many books on, the Sackler family or Dreamland and so many books. And I thought, okay, I'm done and it's going to be hard to beat Dreamland. Or actually, let me rephrase that. It's going to be hard to add something extra. But I felt like your story really, really did add something extra. Particularly the depth. I think it added to my depth and understanding how doctors end up in this situation, how communities end up in this situation, and how all of this is really connected to, there's certainly bad actors, but it's also really, really connected to a desire to actually do a good thing, which is to treat pain.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was really impressed by it. I think it's an excellent book and a great contribution to, yeah.
Well, thank you so much. That's lovely to hear. When you say that you were had some trepidation about the amount of opioid books, I mean, I think of by the time I got around to trying to sell this book to publishers in 2021, we were already very far into the opiate epidemic, and there have been a lot of books published. And I got rejected a bunch of times. And, they don't always give you a reason when publishers pass, but in a few instances, publishers did say, we've published an opioid book or there are too many books out there about this. And I believed, I was well aware of this, but I believed I did have something to contribute amidst all of those other books. So it's really nice to hear you say that. And I appreciate you saying it.
Yeah. And I mean, that's an excellent segue. It was a long journey for you to pull together the book. Was it 10 or 15 years ago the process started? That's when you originally got the idea? You've had a whole career since you started this.
Yeah, so it was a very long road. I mean, I recently turned 40 and the book's been out about a year now. So it came out when I was 39. And I started it when I was in my mid 20s. The clock for this project starts for me in I actually know the exact time because I wrote a diary entry at the time. Hearing this story was like a kind of bolt of lightning from the heavens. But it was in early 2009. I was just starting out a career in journalism. I had written a handful of short, lighthearted pieces for some newspapers in my hometown of Providence, Rhode Island, but I had big ambitions, grown up reading The New Yorker and, had read In Cold Blood, and that had made a big impression on me. So I was the classic, like, eager to do big things, but inexperienced young journalist. And this story idea fell into my lap of basically I learned via overhearing a conversation between my parents about this kind of long lost college and medical school classmate of my dad named Paul Volkman, who at the time in 2009 was under federal indictment for a massive prescription drug dealing scheme that took place in Southern Ohio. He hadn't gone to trial yet. He hadn't yet been convicted or sentenced. Those things were still at an unknown future date. But I knew some very basic facts about the story, and the little I knew drew me in. I mean, I talk in the book about how I knew point A for Paul Volkman, that he and my dad had graduated with MDs and PhDs from the University of Chicago in the mid 1970s. And in fact, the federal government had paid for that high level of education through a program called the Medical Scientist Training Program. And then I didn't know anything about Paul Volkman in between, but I knew that some 30 years later, the government had come back with an interest in Paul Volkman, investigated him, and leveled these really serious allegations against him. Basically, that he was a drug dealing kingpin of a sort, that he was prescribing massive amounts of controlled substances, including opiates, including sedatives like Valium, including muscle relaxers, out of cash only pain clinics in Southern Ohio, and that a number of his patients died. So, those two facts, point A, point B, separated by 30 years, represented a mystery to me and a tantalizing one, an alluring one. What happened
Mm.
to this guy?
Yeah, what happened between these 2 points, between the guy my dad knew and this indictment?
Yeah,
That's
and I should also add just one more thing, which is that in the book, I knew I needed to paint a little bit of a picture of my dad to express how shocking it was that an old classmate of his would be in this situation. My dad is a nerdy, soft spoken, exceedingly polite endocrinologist who sings in civic chorale groups and likes listening to classical music and reading books. And he used to play golf. I mean, he's one of the last. He doesn't get speeding tickets. He doesn't drink or do drugs. He's one of the last people you would expect to know someone accused of these really serious, gnarly crimes. So that was a big part of the allure. Was just like, what happened here? How did these two guys go in such different directions?
Oh, that's interesting, thinking about their 2 different, tracks. I've always felt like every good story starts with just natural curiosity
Mm-hmm.
and a good mystery, right? Because as journalists, whether it's a daily newspaper and we're covering the big story of the day, like what just happened in Minnesota with the shooting of the politicians, or you're doing something more long term, like your work on opioids, it's really natural curiosity and solving the mystery. It sounds like you had that natural curiosity about what was happening in this this situation. And so, could you take us back to 2009? Right now, I think the vast majority of us are aware of the opioid epidemic. Pretty clear that there's a significant problem right now. But back in 2009, as I recall, the concerns were just beginning to emerge. The pain clinics were a little bit undercover, and I even remember back years before where a friend of mine was hired to do public relations for, she was like a high up PR person for the Sackler family
Mm-hmm.
and for Purdue Pharma. And in retrospect, I'm like, okay, now this makes sense. They saw this coming. Um, but what was the public consciousness around the epidemic in 2009?
Well, to answer that, I would go even further back because Volkman's crimes actually took place between 2003 and 2006, which was an even earlier stage in all of this. And maybe to go even further back, just for a frame of reference, the kind of big bang, so to speak, of the opiate epidemic is when OxyContin is released as a product in 1996. And that is seen by many people rightfully as kind of the start of the opiate epidemic. But as you say, it didn't become this thing that we're all used to or even fatigued or numb hearing about overnight. I mean, it's wild to think that if you go, look, 1996, we're now in 2025, we're approaching like 30 years of this crisis, which is just wild to think about. Um, and I think it was a known entity in some parts of the country and in some communities. I mean, I know from my own research that like there were stories on Nightline, or maybe it was 2020, covering this new drug, OxyContin, when that was like in the early 2000s was when, it was kind of reporting on this new drug that nobody had heard of. Um, I do remember vividly going to Southern Ohio, the place where this story really took place in 2010, for the first time and learning about the really extraordinary extent of the damage done to that part of the country, this kind of Appalachian part of Southern Ohio. And I remember being warned that the kind of active state of emergency crisis with regard to pills and opiates there was going to spread and was going to come to me where I mean, at the time I was a grad student in New York, but I'm from Rhode Island. So I remember that warning, which meant that it hadn't really hit Rhode Island yet. And I remember working at a newspaper in Rhode Island 3 or 4 years later and hearing about fentanyl for the first time. And so that kind of prophecy of people telling me in one of the hardest hit parts of the country, this is coming to you, was true.
Shopify's point of sale system helps you sell at every stage of your business. Need a fast and secure way to take payments in person? We've got you covered. How about card readers you can rely on anywhere you sell?
Thanks. Have a good one.
Yep, that too. Want one place to manage all your online and in-person sales? That's kind of our thing. Wherever you sell, businesses that grow with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 a month trial at shopify.com/listen. Shopify.com/listen.
So yeah, I think it was still confined to certain pockets in 2009. Maine and parts of New England were hit really hard early on. Southern Ohio was hit really hard early on, and other parts of Appalachia. South Florida was hit really hard early on. And now, it's everywhere. And I should add one thing. I was recently doing an event with a public health researcher who corrected my language that it isn't even fair to really call it the opiate epidemic anymore. It's more of an overdose epidemic as the mixture of drugs that are out in circulation are no longer simply opiates. There's a lot of other things getting mixed in. So it certainly started with an opiate epidemic, first pills, then heroin, then fentanyl. And now fentanyl is still causing a lot of deaths, but it's also a lot of other substances mixed in.
Right. It's being mixed in with lots of different drugs where people do not even think an opioid or a synthetic opioid is in it, and into all sorts of other challenges. One of the things that, I had mentioned to you that I have a friend who works in the medical affairs department at the Department of Defense. And he's the one who really sat me down and sort of walked me through the history of this epidemic, because I obviously, like in my work related to mental health or with friends, I was exposed to it. And in fact, a psychiatrist that I worked with when in my mental health work, he was part of a practice beside me. One day, his office was raided by the DEA and local Virginia police, and he ultimately ended up being charged. And it was a complex, kind of crazy situation. So I had sort of exposure to some of it and some of the challenges. But this doctor that I was mentioning walked me through how pain management and a desire to sort of like address the fact that the medical community didn't really focus on pain for so many years,
Yeah.
sort of was one of the sparks for uh for for what we're dealing with now. And like you mentioned, it's sort of, the opioids became the gateway for heroin, and heroin became the gateway for fentanyl, and who knows where it's headed next. Um, it, it just seems like such a complex and tough topic to try and tackle. And I'm just curious, was it overwhelming for you in the beginning, or what what led you to sort of like push through and want to tell this story? Because it doesn't sound like easy work.
It was overwhelming, and I find in my interviews and in my book talks, I return to this almost refrain of like, and that was another reason this project took 15 years. And that's one of them is pain, addiction, the opiate epidemic are really slippery subjects to write about for a few different reasons. People have strong feelings about them. You know, early on, I was focused on this kind of separation between folks in the let's treat chronic pain and advocacy for chronic pain patient world versus, and they have very strong feelings about how, pain isn't being treated aggressively enough and these people are being ignored and discarded. And then there's people on the other side who feel very strongly and, you know, with good reason about loved ones who've lost their lives to addiction or overdose, and they have very strong feelings on the opposite side of it. So there was that. I mean, I stumbled into this really at the time. It felt like an issue that stirred the kind of passions and emotion like gun control does or abortion does, albeit on a lower register. So there was that element. There's the fact that there was a lot of kind of disagreement and uncertainty in the medical world about how to prescribe opiates, especially for non-cancer related chronic pain. I mean, I always compare it to my dad's specialty of endocrinology, which is not to say endocrinology is simple, but there aren't the kind of huge disagreements about treatments for, the way to prescribe insulin for diabetes, for instance, or really strong differences of opinion about how to prescribe or not prescribe.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I think there is, I think there's a reason for that. When medicine decided to make pain the fifth vital sign,
Yeah,
all the other vital signs, whether it's your heart rate, your blood pressure, your respiratory rate, they can be measured,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
Um, y- you know, my mom's diabetic, right? You can test for blood sugar and well, my mom's passed away, but she was diabetic. You can test for blood sugar,
Yeah.
but pain just relies on the self-report. And my six isn't your six. This person's, and so it makes it really, really murky, the judgment calls that doctors have to make, I think.
Y- You're right. You just put your finger on another thing that makes this subject really slippery is exactly the lack of objective measurements. We're in 2025. We can do astonishing things technologically in medicine, and yet we still cannot measure objectively a person's pain level in the same way we can measure their body temperature or their respiration rate. And there's an added layer of complication on top of that subjectivity, which is that the pills that this story was about, opiates, um, there is a lot of incentive for patients to be dishonest with their doctors about this already subjective phenomenon. They may be addicted and, they may be terrified of going into withdrawal because withdrawal is an excruciating experience. They may have a financial incentive to sell these pills, which is certainly part of the story I wrote, because these pills, especially in certain parts of the country, command, high prices on the street. So this position we've all been in of the doctor patient relationship in the story I was writing about of a pain doctor in an economically depressed town with a lot of patients who were maybe struggling with substance use, it became this super complex thing to try to untangle and make sense of what was what. Because at the core of the story I was writing was a doctor who claimed he was innocent, who claimed he
Mm.
was a good guy, who was treating people with pain, and doing something noble. And you had prosecutors say, this guy's a criminal.
And traveling 400 miles to do it. And, one of the things I was thinking for a guy who does a weekly commute from Chicago, right, Lakeshore in Chicago,
Yeah.
to southern Ohio on the border with Kentucky and West Virginia,
Yeah.
for someone to do that, you are either a sinner or a saint. You're
Yeah.
you're you're either the world's greatest person because you care so deeply, or something else is going on.
Well, I sometimes encourage people who are hearing about my book to go on Google Maps or whatever and find somewhere 400 miles from where they live, because that's the distance between Chicago and Portsmouth, Ohio, which Volkman was traveling, as you say, on a weekly basis. He would fly to Columbus and drive 2 hours south to Portsmouth and stay there for the week, and then he would do the reverse on Friday. So imagine that you are going to that place 400 miles from where you live on a weekly basis. And you're right. I think the sinner saint dichotomy is an apt one. And that was really what the trial was about. Was this guy a sinner or a saint? That was, was he a legitimate doctor or was he a drug dealer?
And just to give people perspective, if you were sitting where I am in Washington, D.C., and you traveled to New York City, that wouldn't be far enough. You'd have to make it almost up to Hartford, like Bridgeport or Connecticut. Yeah, it is that far on a weekly basis. And he was flying into Columbus, right?
Yeah.
And then from Chicago to Columbus, and then driving a couple hours to get to this very rural Appalachia and through mountains.
And so in some ways, Jason, this book is about a guy with a really unusual commute.
Yes, yes. It's
about a lot more than that, but that was certainly one of the things that drew me in to the story initially. That reminds me, one of the early facts I knew about the case, even when I knew very little else, was that Paul Volkman was indicted in 2007, and he was arrested at his apartment on North Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. And that image of federal agents kind of swooping into what I imagined to be what in real life was a pretty high-end building overlooking Lake Michigan in Chicago in one of the most posh parts of the city. That image, perhaps more than anything else, is what got me on this story. I wanted to know what happened. And they were there to arrest him for crimes that took place 3 states away.
Right. I mean, yeah. I mean, just to think about that, this guy's getting on a plane, passing Indiana, Michigan, to go to Ohio, to be a doctor. And I imagine there were probably other opportunities for him to even do pain management in a place like Chicago. What kind of reason did he give? I knew you interviewed him in the book. What was his story about why he made that crazy commute?
So just to backtrack for a minute, I mentioned at the top of our conversation that I started out with a mystery of what happened between point A and point B. What happened between Volkman's graduation with an MD, PhD, and his indictment. The book, which wound up, as you know, being 400 pages, solves the mystery to the extent that I could using the tools of journalism. And it goes beyond just that. And
do you need the tools of psychology to solve the rest of the mystery?
Well, I stopped short of diagnosing him in the book, which we can talk about that choice. But so I say that to say that the book winds up telling this guy's story from A to Z. His complete biography goes into detail into his crimes, into the people affected, and to the community where it happened. And I say that as a entry point to your question about the commute, because Volkman didn't break bad, so to speak, until 2003. He graduated from medical school in 1974. So he had already had a decades-long medical career and an unusual, meandering, and kind of scandal-ridden career at that. So I needed to tell the story of how he got to this place, this unusual place, in the first place. And I do that in the first part of the book. To make a very long story short, Paul and my dad were trained to be researchers. not even trained to see patients full time. Volkman flamed out of research pretty quickly after grad school, after medical school, for reasons I explain in the book, as is often the case in this story. He says it was one thing. The facts, as I could determine them, pointed to another direction. He then goes into pediatrics in Chicago. Um,
That was the situation where he said he cured something. His supervisor didn't believe it was cured, and he decided to bounce out of research. Is that the...
yes, that is exactly right. He claimed to, during his brief stint in research, have come up with a brilliant new treatment for a certain kind of stroke. And he was going to write up the paper and send it off to the relevant journal, and surely glory awaited. But he said when his lab director came back from a vacation or some time away, the lab director didn't understand or didn't want to publish it and refused to allow Volkman to co-sign this, what Volkman said was brilliant paradigm shifting research. And so that was a disillusioning event that pushed Volkman out of research. I wound up speaking to that lab director who said he barely remembered Volkman. He said the guy basically fit in with the wallpaper, and he didn't remember any extraordinary research. He remembered a guy who worked a lot outside of the lab, moonlighting to pay the bills.
Mm.
I present both those stories in the book, as I often do at different parts of the story, where Volkman says one thing, often a self-aggrandizing narrative that portrays him as brilliant or heroic, and the facts are often underwhelming or downright, incriminatory.
So tell me a little bit about the narrative of that journey, for Volkman, because one of the things that, and I don't know whether this is an impression that you were trying to leave, but he graduates with a MD and a PhD, relatively rare,
Yeah.
to get both degrees. I know there's some programs where you can do that, but it's relatively rare, and it stands out. Looks like he has a promising career on the surface. When he walks out of research, he works as a pediatrician, he works in ER, he works as a traveling doctor. It looks like on the outside that he had a very good career. However, and looking at your reporting, it seems like underneath the surface, that wasn't exactly true. There were people who were really concerned about, even before you get to the pain mill issues, really concerned about some of his behavior as a doctor.
Yes. The reason he winds up in Southern Ohio in the early 2000s working in pain management was because he had become uninsurable, unable to obtain malpractice insurance. Now, whether that was because the rates got to be too expensive or he was like actively blacklisted, I never quite figured out. But the result was he couldn't get malpractice insurance. And the reason for that was because over the course of those years you mentioned as a pediatrician, as an emergency room doctor, who took short stints at different dozens of hospitals around the Midwest, he was sued a number of times for malpractice. One case involved a guy who had hit his head during some kind of a bar fight. Volkman examined him and sent him home, and the guy wound up having a brain bleed that lasted longer than it should have, because he was sent home and wound up having permanent cognitive
Hmm.
difficulties as a result. He sued Volkman, or rather his father, who was at that time became his legal guardian, sued Volkman. There was a situation in an emergency room in Wisconsin where a woman wound up having her arm amputated below the elbow, and some decisions Volkman made in the emergency room before that sequence of events were called into question. The most alarming of these was a infant who came to his office with her parents when he was a pediatrician in the late 1980s in Chicago, developed a severe fast-moving breathing issue called epiglottitis, and decisions that Volkman made, namely to not allow the child to be transported to a local emergency room. He says, that he needed to save this young girl's life by intubating her in his office. Uh,
And that's when you open airway, right?
Correct.
Right.
Correct. Yeah, you
It's
force
a
the
surgical
yeah,
procedure.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, people who go on ventilators, like for COVID, they were intubated. It's when they
Hmm.
placed it down your windpipe. Um, and that wasn't successful, and the child ultimately died. Volkman blames other people for this.
And that was like a 1-year-old, right?
Correct. He said that
Yeah.
the equipment that the EMTs brought him that he requested was faulty. A suction machine, air tanks. He blamed other people for what happened. He said his actions in this instance were quote unquote heroic, even though this girl died. There was a lawsuit over that, and a jury ultimately found him liable.
And
So,
then there was the epinephrine one.
well, yeah, that didn't even turn into a lawsuit. That was
Right.
just a crazy story about Volkman's traveling emergency room years that I kind of accidentally stumbled into. I'm sure you know this as a journalist when you accidentally hit pay dirt.
Yes, yes.
You're interviewing somebody. I was interviewing somebody about another
That
story.
moment where you're like, what?
Exactly. I was interviewing a responding nurse from a child specialty hospital who had responded to the call about the infant story. I was interviewing her about that. And at some point it came up. She's like, I have this other story about Volkman. And I was like, go on. And she told this other story about this really odd and unsettling encounter she had with him years later at a hospital in, I think, Gary, Indiana, where their team, which was like serving the Chicago area for this pediatric specialty hospital, was summoned to this emergency room where a young girl was having an asthma attack, but the situation, as she described it, was more or less under control, despite the fact that transport had been requested. However, Volkman was the attending emergency room doctor, and it became clear when this team arrived to transport this girl that Volkman wanted to give her intracardiac epinephrine, basically like what happened in Pulp Fiction.
Epinephrine in the heart, right? Or, right, in the
One of the
cardiac
most
system.
dramatic and severe interventions you can do. And this transport nurse,
And dangerous, right?
oh yeah, this
Yeah.
transport nurse was like, I've never even heard of that. This is so beyond the pale. She had barely even heard of that when it comes to adults. And this girl, in her mind, needed nowhere near that level of treatment. And in fact, she felt this, hyper aggressive, arguably savior-esque proposed treatment from Volkman was dangerous. And she and some other people on the scene, both on her team and at the hospital, had to like resort to kind of impromptu subterfuge to like create a distraction basically for Volkman to leave the girl's side. And as she told it, they kind of whisked this girl away to safety.
That's so
So
wild.
that wasn't a lawsuit story. That was just a story by somebody who years ago when I was interviewing her had a very creepy and unsettling encounter with.
So you've got like nurses hiding patients from him in this case because I guess they sort of felt like he had a godlike complex. They couldn't trust his judgment. You've got the malpractice insurance companies certainly know something's up. And, sometimes that stuff is really hard to even find out about as a patient. I assume the medical boards probably relatively early on had their stack of complaints. They tend to go with the lawsuits. So and I'm sure the insurance companies probably pick up on some weirdness, the health insurance companies. All these parts of the systems have like little blinking lights. What is it about either medicine or being a physician that didn't lead to or doesn't lead to an intervention there?
Well, uh, a few things. I mean, when it came to reporting about Volkman, this wasn't quite your question, but I'll get to your question. Here's a guy who's much older than me, much more qualified than me. I'm in my 20s. I don't have an MD or a PhD, and he's telling me about each of these malpractice cases and eventually the alleged criminal activity. That's not what happened. What happened was XYZ. I was doing this thing that was appropriate. This person or this organization or this part of the world was out to screw me. And when he said that about things like malpractice lawyers, I got screwed by the system. I was targeted by predatory, sketchy lawyers who were out for a quick buck. I mean, he didn't make that narrative up out of whole cloth. That's a narrative floating around in the world that some people believe. And so I had to figure out, it sounds somewhat plausible. Yeah, I know malpractice lawyers might be a little sketchy. What do I know? So I had to figure that out. And I was just, it was kind of like me against this towering guy in terms of his qualifications.
Mm.
That took a long time for me to, again, that's one of the reasons this project took 15 years. Back to your question of why did nobody intervene? Actually, at one point they tried. One of the mysteries that remained, even when I finished this story, was after the incident with the child where Volkman is sued for what's deemed to be reckless, dangerous behavior. The Illinois Medical Board does, in fact, issue a complaint against him. I got this via the Illinois FOIA. I made a request and got it. They do, in fact, say your actions were reckless, dangerous, seem to have caused the death of this child. We are moving to suspend or revoke your license. The mystery is how he wriggled his way out of that, because he did. I don't know what happened there. That's where the kind of paper trail goes cold. But somehow he did wriggle his way out of that. He hired a lawyer. He talked his way out of it. I don't know. But this is a story in part of not just a lack of intervention, which I think there was, but interventions that didn't have teeth. He was somehow able to fight that off and continue to practice. And obviously would be a much different story. But to your question, I came away from this reporting project thinking that medical boards are rarely the ones leading the charge to take down a doctor. They are often bringing up the rear after criminal charges or lawsuits have been filed. That was the impression I got. Maybe that was what happened in this case.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not necessarily the most comforting thing to think about as a patient.
Yeah, yeah.
But I would
And
also say that there were aspects of Volkman's career that helped him keep a low profile. He never had a medical partner. He was always a lone wolf, whether that was as a pediatrician or as a traveling doctor. For many years, he hopped around from job to job, what are called locum tenens gigs, temp work for doctors for days, weeks, months at a time, worked at dozens of different hospitals, didn't stay at one place for very long. And so, unlike my dad, for instance, again, who I was always comparing this story to, my dad worked in the same office. He still works there now as an endocrinologist. And for many years, he had a partner in that office, another endocrinologist who worked with him, who, if anything would have gone haywire with my dad and he started acting erratically, would have blown a whistle or done something. Volkman didn't have those kind of guardrails. So that's another part of the story.
I remember reading, I think it was in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and it was a very fascinating story. And I think they were focusing on Pike County, Socoto County, some of these southern Appalachian counties. And they walked through the story of Dr. John Lilly.
Yeah.
And he's believed to be one of the first major pill mills down there.
Yeah.
And I think it was in the late 90s. It was the late 90s. And in it, he had cash and shoe boxes in the basement of his home, was prescribing it in that sort of cash only basis. They sent in undercover officers. He wasn't doing anything other than just sort of asking for what people wanted. And I think it was nearly 500,000 Oxycontin or oxycodone. So both Oxycontin and I guess Percocet has oxycodone in it. But it was 500,000 pills, which is insane for me in a career, much less 1 year. But they go through the story and then they talk about how when he was shut down, this other doctor came in and stepped in. And then another doctor after that doctor, and I think that doctor went to federal prison. It, and it was all sort of like the same MO, same approach. How do we even know how he got the idea of going to Southern Ohio to be a doctor?
Well, the kind of the chain of corrupt doctors is a story that I felt I needed to tell because Lilly was one of the key predecessors to Volkman, and there were also successors to Volkman. What I found when I finally went down to Southern Ohio was that this had been going on for a long time before Volkman, and it went on a long time after him with a lot of different doctors and a lot of the same facts about these places: high levels of pills, no affiliation with any local hospital, often people running the businesses who had no medical background, oftentimes alarming amounts of security on site, oftentimes dispensaries for pills on site, as in no pharmacy necessary. There was like a business model that was kind of picked up from person to person, which, by the way, when I learned about this, made Volkman's story of his own innocence, I think, a lot harder to believe. And I wanted to present that story because of that.
Like the idea that this chain existed, people knew about it, he stepped into it.
Exactly. I mean, for me, I had this unique experience of I met Volkman before I went to Southern Ohio, and I spent days with him in 2009. He was one of the first people I interviewed for this project, listening to his side of the story. And it wasn't entirely convincing. I didn't walk out away from those interviews saying this guy is for sure innocent, but he certainly told quite a detailed story that was persuasive in certain ways, and he had an answer for every sketchy detail. But when I went to Southern Ohio, any air of plausibility to the story evaporated because this place was so hard hit by drugs and by these kinds of clinics specifically, and these people were so hardened and cynical about these doctors that nobody believed this guy was legit. I had one journalist who I spoke to down there said, "Which one was he?" There was a long list of doctors. I forget which names there are. That was the vibe down there. Um, so how did he find Southern Ohio? Well, we're jumping around a bit in the narrative here, but at the moment when he becomes uninsurable in the early 2000s, he has been making a decent amount of money up to that point. He's living on Lakeshore Drive, paying a lot of rent, thousands of dollars in rent each month, and he's desperate for employment. And without medical malpractice insurance, his possibilities for a job were severely diminished. And he is desperate, basically. And he goes online and finds an ad for, I don't know exactly where it was posted, but it was for a pain clinic in Southern Ohio where malpractice insurance was not needed. And
So he responded to an ad
correct.
for a pain clinic from a person who's not a doctor, which is, it's kind of an interesting thing because, like, for example, in law, you can't run a legal practice. You cannot be the head person in a legal practice without being a lawyer. But in medicine, anyone can get in the game of running a medical practice.
Well, one of the reforms that they passed in the midst of or in the wake of this was they tried, I forget whether it was on the city or state level in Ohio, to change that. Like, you needed to be a doctor to own a clinic. But a lot of damage had already been done at that point.
Mm. So what happened when he went down there?
So the woman who had posted that ad was named Denise Huffman, and she and Volkman would eventually be indicted together, along with her daughter, Alice. There were 3 names on his ultimate indictment. And Denise is a fascinating character in her own right. She has no medical training, does not have a graduate degree, does not have a college degree. She dropped out of high school, eventually got a GED. She worked in factories and in fast food restaurants. She had a lot of her own health issues over the years, apparently. And it was her own health issues and those of folks in her family, her firsthand experience with chronic pain, that she says um, led her to feel qualified to open a pain clinic and inspired her, so to speak, to feel as though this was the kind of business the area needed. That is her narrative. People around that region, when I asked, said no, she saw what was happening with these other clinics, saw how successful they were up to a point. A lot of the people went to prison and said, I can do this. And so, again, there's differing narratives about Denise's motivations. But the fact was, she opened a clinic in 2001. First, it was across the river in a small town in Kentucky. And I did a little bit of research about that. You know, it had a pretty checkered past, despite it having only been open for 2 years before Volkman arrived. They had been written up in local papers. A number of doctors had run into trouble either with Denise and Alice or with the Kentucky Board of Medical Licensure. Eventually, they hopped over the river, the Ohio River, into southern Ohio. She needs a doctor. Volkman needs a job. They become partners, so to speak, or she's his boss. She paid him a salary for the bulk of his time down there. Um, and it was a mutually beneficial relationship. He went in, saw these patients who paid cash to see him. There were no third-party payments accepted, no credit cards, no workers' comp, no Medicaid, cash. And very early on, a number of local pharmacists balked at the prescriptions this new doctor was writing. They thought they were excessive, they were dangerous. They didn't want to sign off on scripts for these amounts of opiates, this amount of Valium, this amount of sedatives or muscle relaxers, all prescribed in combination with each other. And one by one, as they later testified at his trial, they said, we're not going to be a part of this. So
It's interesting you said that, because those are all drugs that in high amounts are dangerous together, because they all are central nervous system depressants. So a pharmacist is going to know in large quantities, probably not the world's best idea, or something else is going on here.
And Volkman, because he's a very smart guy whose PhD is in pharmacology, would tell people, at least he would claim, that there were good reasons for each of these prescriptions. He said these people were in severe intractable pain, that their, other courses of treatment, including surgeries and nerve blocks and injections, hadn't worked. So they needed the opiates, and they needed a second opiate for breakthrough pain. And they needed the muscle relaxers for leg spasms, which many of them had, and they needed the Valium to be able to sleep. That is what he said. Again, people around there said, no, this was the cocktail that these clinics all used, because that's what sold, basically. But eventually, this partnership between Paul and Denise runs into a wall where within a few months of his arrival, basically all the local pharmacists have refused to fill the scripts. And they do something which at the time was legal, although somewhat surprising. They applied for a license from the Ohio Board of Pharmacy to open up an in-house dispensary inside the clinic, to become a one-stop shop where
no pharmacist, just
Volkman was signed up to be the acting
pharmacist. That is baffling to me. It is a pain, right? Like, I'm sitting in my doctor's office, he writes me a prescription, and I have to either go across the street or across town or to another town to get my prescription. But I also understand that there's like safety built into that, right? Because my pharmacist can tell, in theory, in old school, if I'm going to the same pharmacist, can tell what medications I'm on, whether, any of them are contraindicated. Now we have these prescription databases too that should catch this kind of stuff. But why did Ohio? I think you kind of captured it, but tell me if I'm right. And you did a wonderful job of capturing sort of rural Appalachia in the piece. But was it because rural communities didn't necessarily have enough pharmacies, they passed that kind of law? Because it seems like a dangerous law, or one that you should be selective about. How about that?
I actually don't know what the origins of that law were, but my understanding, and I forget where I got this, was this was not a law designed to green light massive amounts of opiates from being prescribed inside a pain clinic. I think it was designed, as you say, with rural doctors in mind, who are maybe a bit out, in the middle of nowhere, and where it would be a hassle for patients to have to schlep to the nearest pharmacy. I think it was designed for the ease of that situation. Um, but Volkman and Denise, they got a visit from the Ohio Board of Pharmacy. The guy checked out the clinic. He explained to them and Denise's daughter, Alice, who worked at the clinic, the very specific rules that they were supposed to be abiding by. They needed to keep meticulous records. Volkman needed to inspect and sign off on every pill that went out the door. These were things they said, sure. They didn't actually do. But they got the green light. And then the clinic kicks into pretty high gear, where people are coming to them, seeing the doctor, getting a prescription, literally walking down the hall, filling the prescription. All of it is cash, and they are walking away with a lot of pills in their pocket.
Wow.
And Denise is making a lot of money as the owner of the clinic, and Paul is being paid handsomely, around $5,000 a week, as the clinic's lone physician on staff.
Wow. Wow. So I wanted to ask you how ultimately the authorities caught up to him. And and also one of the interesting things about his case that's very different than the ones that I've read, he has one of the longest sentences I've ever seen for this. What was it? 4 life sentences?
Consecutive life sentences.
Consecutive life sentences. So not happening at the same time concurrently, 4 life sentences. 14 patients that they identified, is that right? Who had died soon after receiving prescriptions from him. And, in medicine, it's really complex. I remember running into this with some psychiatrists in my area who'd prescribed medication. Patients died. And, the way ultimately was determined whether they're responsible, because psychiatry is a bit like, pain, where you just have the reports of your patients, was other doctors reviewed their work and made a determination on it. But what led to such a harsh punishment in his case?
Well, you are right that there have been overall hundreds of doctors accused and convicted of some kind of opiate-related crimes during the opiate epidemic in virtually every state, in some states many times over, like Ohio, like Florida. And I have yet to find a case which resulted in a longer sentence than the one Volkman got, 4 consecutive life terms. It is a high watermark for an entire era. And I've thought a lot about what were the reasons for that. And there are a lot of reasons. The biggest reason is probably the fact that he didn't take a plea deal, which in my case, as a journalist, wound up being helpful, because it meant that there was a trial.
Trial transcripts.
People testified, 70 for the prosecution, and there were 4,000 pages of trial transcripts.
Wow.
And that allowed me to both have access to the courtroom via the transcripts, but that testimony also took me, and I could take my readers inside the clinics themselves. So the way prosecutors get people to plead guilty is by offering them a more appealing sentence, more lenient sentence than one they would get if they took it to trial and rolled the dice. So right there, that was a reason Volkman got a large sentence. Another reason was he showed no remorse at any point.
Yeah, he seemed pretty unrepentant to the end.
Very much so, to the extent where he called at his sentencing hearing, where he was acting at that point as his own lawyer because he had fired his court-appointed lawyer, he said, "I have no apologies to make." And he also called the judge a heinous criminal, which not a good way to get a lenient sentence.
No. Going back to your point about not diagnosing, I'm starting to pick up a pattern between the, godlike, stabbing with epinephrine, the way he treated sentencing in court. And I feel like you don't need to diagnose him. We all know.
Right, right. So he didn't take a plea deal. He was unrepentant. I don't want to say the judge gave him 4 sentences because he insulted her, but I think that certainly didn't help. There was the fact of his conduct was egregious and lasted more than 2 years. And there were multiple off ramps that he could have taken. For instance, when patients died, or when he was raided by authorities, which happened multiple times, or when family members of patients came and pleaded with him to stop prescribing to their loved one, or after their loved one died, called him up to say this was your fault. These were all moments where he could have said, you know what, I'm going to go home to Chicago and call it a day. He didn't. There was also, and they had at the point of the sentencing heard all of this often heartrending testimony from people. So the facts had been laid out. There was also the fact that of all cases, and this is part of what interested me about this story, the he should have known better factor was off the charts because he was an MD and a PhD, and his PhD was in pharmacology, the study of how medicines affect the body.
So in a way, his credentials and worked against him.
I mean, I'm somewhat reading between the lines.
Yeah, yeah.
But I don't think it's too far of a leap. I mean, judges take these things into account. They hear your life story and they consider, if you've had a hard Scrabble background, maybe that factors in. He didn't. He had an MD PhD from the University of Chicago.
Or you made a mistake, right? But I can tell you're smart, you're unrepentant, and you're still arguing your innocence after.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
And basically, all of which is to say, his case is almost a clinic in how to get an extremely long sentence.
Right. Yes. Right.
Long thing.
He could give a course. Well, one of the interesting things too about it being a doctor, him being a doctor, it's a little different than your regular street drug dealer, right? Like, guy on the street sells someone some fentanyl or a bad batch of cocaine, and somebody dies. They're already committing a crime just by selling it. It's kind of black and white. Like, you don't need anybody to analyze his actions to determine what's reasonable.
Yes.
And that was one of the interesting things for the book for me, because you really, really got into that idea of how do you figure out how something is reasonable. And I had mentioned to you the doctor that I had worked with, who there was actually a raid in his office. And what the argument came down to, which was really fascinating, was the local police came in and had said to him, hey, look, this woman you're prescribing drugs to is reselling them. Stop prescribing them to him. And then with perfect doctor arrogance, and I love this guy, he's a good guy. Perfect doctor arrogance, he said, I'm not going to listen to what they say. I'm the one who's the doctor. They don't know what patients need.
Yeah.
Well, that one woman who was selling the drug, she was actually handing them off to her boyfriend who was selling, was part of a much larger drug ring. And so I tell him what really got you in trouble was the defiance in that situation. Everything is going to be looked at much more skeptically at that point. But there's the opposite side of the coin. I have my own psychiatrist and psychiatrists that I've worked with before and also other medical doctors who are very, very gun shy about prescribing certain things, even if they think they're effective, because they don't want to get on the radar screen of boards. They don't want to get on the radar screen of the insurance companies or pharmacists or anybody who's going to raise a flag.
What did DEA?
Yeah. Right. DEA is who I was thinking of. And I even think recently I was talking to a friend of mine who's undergoing treatment for cancer and was a part of a clinical trial and is having some real complications against it. But the doctors who were treating her were just very, like when she went on an ER visit recently, very reluctant to prescribe opioids, but nothing was doing a dent in her pain. And two things I'm wondering about, like, how do you decide what's reasonable? And has the pendulum maybe swung a little too far in the opposite direction?
When you say, well, how do you decide what's reasonable? Do you mean like how do they
A
decide
doctor.
in court?
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
I mean, so here again was another thing that interested me about this case. Volkman was not charged with murder or manslaughter. He was charged with prescription drug dealing, a violation of the Controlled Substances Act, with death or injury resulting. Um, he was charged with some gun possession, but the main things were breaches of the Controlled Substances Act. Um, and to your point about, the gray area, unlike if this were a cocaine dealer or an ecstasy dealer, I'm fascinated by how the same pill, an oxycodone pill, in one person's hand or pocket can be legal if they have a prescription for it, and in another person's pocket can be illegal if they don't have a prescription for it. I'm just fascinated by how that works. The Controlled Substances Act does not list amounts of pills under which it's legal and above which it's illegal. They don't have that. That's not how it works. It hinges on the highly subjective.
It's not like 10 pills a month is
Exactly.
legal
I mean,
and right.
state legislatures have I think come in and tried to put caps on the amount of pills people can be prescribed. As this or the amount of days that they can prescribe for. But the Controlled Substances Act does not have that. Instead, it hinges on words like legitimate in the course of legitimate medical practice. So there we have Volkman's fate basically hinged on this highly subjective word of was what he was doing medically legitimate. And so this became a case of dueling experts. And I take readers inside the courtroom to hear from the experts on both sides. The ones for the prosecution who said that what he was doing was beyond the pale, it was drug dealing, it was outrageous, it caused the deaths of these patients. And the ones that he called in his defense that said, no, this was reasonable pain medicine. And from what they could tell, people didn't seem to die as a result. They died of other illnesses. Um, so that question of how do you tell what's reasonable, what's not, or what's legal and what's not, it's not simple. Um,
It's really based on the expert evidence a jury has to
right,
make a
and
decision.
and ultimately, I don't want to give the impression that the jury was necessarily deadlocked. I spoke to some jurors, and they were pretty well convinced that he was far over the line, but it was a judgment call.
Right.
And there was some dispute within the jury deliberations about culpability. Culpability and responsibility, that's another interesting thing of like putting the legality aside is like who's responsible for a bad outcome if a patient, let's say, lies to a doctor about their symptoms and gets pills that way and then takes them in ways other than advised. Whose responsibility is that? You might be inclined to think there is some patient responsibility. On the other hand, when a doctor does this again and again and again and does it in an area that's already ravaged by prescription drug abuse and has an MD PhD and is not interested in hearing input from family members, I lay out all the facts. There was a
Yeah.
lot of damning evidence and testimony against Paul Volkman.
Yeah. And it's kind of that idea. You think of this profession that's supposed to do no harm. Like there is patient responsibility at times, but the doctor should be the brake on that, not the accelerator on it. And I think that's where it gets complicated. But something you said just reminded me of what I would consider one of the most jaw dropping, hilarious and frightening things I read in the book when I realized, you mentioned this idea of doctors trying to determine what's legitimate, that he had worked as a expert witness on medical malpractice cases.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
How was his malpractice not an issue?
That's a good question. And so to back up, Volkman had, as I said, an odd career as a doctor, a little bit of research, some pediatrics, moonlighting in emergency rooms, and also as a source of income, he was an expert witness in malpractice cases, um, for which he was paid pretty handsomely. Um, and the idea being that for all of these malpractice cases, which usually hinge on subjective interpretations of things like negligence or standard of care, for juries or whoever's hearing the case to determine whether there was malpractice on both sides, experts, doctors, or academic doctors testify after reviewing the available material, and they are paid handsomely for that. And it's a whole cottage industry that I didn't really think about. But I did for this case because Volkman had done that kind of work as a medical expert. And what was interesting, and again speaks to his personality, was he called the expert witnesses who testified against him in his criminal case whores. He said they were sellouts without any kind of acknowledgement that he had done this work for himself and made quite a bit of money from it over the course of his career. That didn't seem to be hypocritical or contradictory in his mind. They were simply whores to him.
One of the, I think, most powerful but surprising things to me in the book, only because I didn't expect you to do this, but it's toward the end where you start to tell the stories of the victims. And I think you did a beautiful job of capturing a couple things. One is addiction and its complexities. Um, the area, the region, I feel like it came off very authentically.
Mm.
Um, but another thing that I thought was really powerful, and I've got a double-barreled question here for you, um, was the humanity that you brought to the victims, which just reminds me of something also related to all journalism that we don't really talk about. There's a human toll for us when we tell other people's stories. And I can't imagine 15 years, 14 deaths, plus all the other stories. So I was going to just ask why you felt it was important to tell the victim stories and what the impact on you was and how you managed it.
There were, thank you for those very kind words. I thought a lot and worried a lot about writing about a region that I wasn't from, writing about a region in Appalachia that has been not always treated well or with respect. And similarly, I had apprehensions about writing about addiction because that is also a stigmatized and disrespected community. Um, I approached the victim stories the way I did for many reasons. One, I think we talked at the beginning of why did I feel this was a story, given so many of the existing stories about the opiate epidemic that was worth telling, was because at this point, decades into this crisis, we have all become overwhelmed by the death tolls, the state death tolls, the annual death tolls. They're in the hundreds of thousands. And the opportunity or the occasion to tell the stories of 10, 11, 12 people allowed me to put a face on those overwhelming death tolls. I have taught journalism classes, taught narrative feature journalism classes, and I say to students, I think one of the jobs of the journalist in this kind of work is to, well, two things: resensitize us to things we've become desensitized to, and also humanize populations or people or places that have become dehumanized. Those are things that I think this work is really important for.
Yeah.
So that was one reason. I also, in many ways, Well, so I'll say a couple things. One, I was somewhat apprehensive about true crime as a genre because it is not monolithically good or bad. Um, there's a lot of examples of both and a lot of in between, and some stories,
Hmm.
documentaries, magazine stories, books make you feel icky for reading them. And you're like,
Yeah.
ooh, I wouldn't have made that choice, or ooh, I don't like this person's approach. Others, I think, are some of the most moving and important works of art and journalism that we've got. There's a wide range. And I certainly wanted to do something that was more on the admirable side. And I think one of the tests of a true crime story is, are the victims humanized? Or are they disregarded, disrespected, sensationalized in favor of just kind of a lurid glimpse at the perpetrator at the expense of the victims? I didn't want to do that. I knew Volkman was going to take up a lot of oxygen in the story, but I didn't want him to take up all the
All
oxygen.
of it.
I
Right.
wanted
As much as he may have wanted him to
exactly.
take up all of it.
And that brings me to one more point, which is that, as you know from reading the book, Jason, I've sometimes described it as kind of one long act of fact checking a very unreliable narrator. Volkman
Mm.
says things that are untrue or misleading or self aggrandizing at every stage of his career, even in his personal life. And these things, he's just not reliable. Some things are flat out false, some things are half truths, some things are distortions. And at various places in the narrative, I fact check him. But there's also a rebuke on the level of, I don't think he saw these people as fully human. I know he called them hillbillies. That was in an email that was submitted as evidence during the trial.
Mm.
I know he didn't respect Portsmouth, Ohio as a place. He spoke about it, as he did many other the small towns where he worked, in highly disparaging terms. So I don't think he saw the people or the place as fully human or worthy of his respect. And that deserved a response as well. And so I didn't just do it to rebuke him, because these people were human and they deserve to be treated as three-dimensional people regardless. But it had that added um, motivation of, like, just as I'm fact checking this guy, I'm also like, I don't know, morality checking or soul checking, or however you want to call it. Like, I'm offering a rebuke to his whole disdain for these people in general.
Makes complete sense to me.
And
I
now
get,
I'll say just one more thing,
yeah.
which is that you've probably done this kind of work. I was really I hadn't done this kind of heavy duty reporting necessarily, tragedy reporting before this
Hmm.
project. And I was really nervous about approaching the loved ones of these many victims, especially their kids, because these crimes had happened like 15 years before, and a lot of the parents of the victims had passed away. So I was either reaching out to people their age or younger, and I didn't know what younger generations knew about it. uh, I didn't I was often approaching them via Facebook, because that turned out to just kind of be the best way. Best in quotes. It wasn't a great way, but it was the best way. Um, and so I was nervous about it. I didn't want to be breaking news to people in a way that, be telling them things they didn't know. And anyway, at some point I got a pep talk. I sought a pep talk from my friend Amanda Milkovitz, who's a veteran crime reporter for a
Hmm.
journal, now at the Boston Globe. And she reminded me that here I was envisioning all the ways me reaching out to these people could go badly. She reminded me that it was possible, and in fact, likely even, that they would be glad to hear from me, that they would want a chance to speak about their loved one, that they would appreciate my curiosity. And that didn't always turn out to be true, but that turned out to be true a lot of the time. And those conversations I had with the loved ones of these victims were some of the most moving and rewarding and meaningful conversations of this entire project. So I was additionally motivated to just honor the living survivors of these folks.
You can give them voice.
Yeah.
It's one of the real beauties, and I think a lot of people experience that nervousness, but I think when you realize that you may be the first or the second person who's allowed, the way I put it is it gives people an opportunity to sing their song for their loved one that they lost. And
Mm.
there's something very, I think, very, very special about being able to do that. I wanted to ask you one more thing.
Yeah.
Portsmouth had all the things: rural, Appalachian, poverty, on the border of West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio. So you had the opportunity for patients to hop across the
Yeah.
border and get around the state prescription systems, and doctors also played games around that as well. Um, what do you hope for the community? I feel like you captured the community's humanity. And what do you hope for that region?
That's a really good question. Um, well, I hope, you know, I think a lot of the stories that I'm drawn to, I live in Providence, Rhode Island, which, is among other things a post-industrial town. We have things that can hide that a little better than some other towns around here in Rhode Island or Massachusetts because we have a state capital and financial district and a number of colleges, but it's a post-industrial town. And Rhode Island as a state is still trying to figure out who it is after being an industrial powerhouse. And that's the story of Portsmouth, Ohio. In many ways, that's the story of the United States.
Yeah. From Maine to Alabama
Right.
to
Is who are we as communities, as states, as a country after the factories leave? And I don't have a specific prescription, no pun intended, for Portsmouth for what's going to happen next to them, for them, because they've been trying to figure that out. I mean, one of the things that really interested me, and there was probably enough for a whole other book, but I just tried to touch on it in a chapter, is Portsmouth has become a hub for recovery and, I say business, recovery opportunities. And that is, in some ways, a boon for the city that certainly needs industries to lift it up. But it's
hmm,
also a very controversial thing because a lot of folks in that town don't want to be the hub for recovery because
hmm.
patients are stigmatized and attitudes about that. Um, so what do I hope for the place? I hope they find a healthy and sustaining new identity for them after the identity that they had that was so strong of a place where things were made, where
Hmm.
bricks were made and shoes were made and steel was made. I don't know what that identity is, but I hope that they find it, something healthy and sustainable. Because for a minute, or not more than a minute, after the factories left, they became Pill Mill Town, USA. And that's what
Right.
the story was about in many ways. And I certainly, I mean, one of the things I wanted people to show, what I wanted to show in this book was, here was Volkman in his apartment in Chicago talking about how good of a doctor he was in these pain clinics and how much he was helping people. You go down there, they hate the pain clinics.
Right.
They
Right.
thought the pain clinics were the scourge of the region. So I'm glad that that era is over, and I hope that they find something new that works for them, whether
Yeah.
Green New Deal, whether that's a recovery industry, whether that's embracing an identity more as a college town, which they've done. Shawnee State University's there. That's what I hope for them. The ability to move forward in a healthy and sustainable way.
It's awesome. Yeah, I happened to read on some of the recovery stories in prepping for this, reading from one of the treatment centers.
Mm.
And it was really kind of inspiring to hear some of those stories. I mean, I think there is a lot of stigma around addiction, but I always tell people, if you want a real solid friend, if you want somebody who's been through some stuff and who will be there for you, there's nothing like a friend in recovery. And
There,
maybe that can help.
yeah, I mean, there's a number of organizations offering recovery services there, but the biggest one is called the Counseling Center. And somebody who worked with the Counseling Center, he maybe had retired by the last interview I had with him, said that the Counseling Center in Portsmouth, was the Cleveland Clinic of recovery. So they were, they had that kind of reputation.
Wow.
And, the symbolism was almost so on the nose, I couldn't have made this up if I tried. But as the story I was writing was ending, and as I left Portsmouth, I started going there in 2010. My last trips there were in 2021, 2022. The Counseling Center was in the process of rehabilitating a former shoe factory and taking it over and revitalizing it. I mean, it's such a potent image. So I hope that turns into a long and sustainable thing for them. And I love the people of Portsmouth and the people of Southern Ohio. I really grew quite fond of that place.
Yeah. And hopefully the next doctor who comes down from Chicago to work there is doing something good.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, thanks, Philip. I really appreciate it. I'm sure people are going to find they're really going to enjoy this conversation. It's not every day in the world of true crime that you both get true crime and you get an opportunity to explore the underlying sociological, psychological, and economic issues. And I can't more highly recommend your book.
Well, thank you so much, Jason, for reading this book and for bringing me on the show and for the very kind things you said about it. And just to your point, here again, I'm going to come back to that refrain of that was another reason this took 15 years. It was the richness of this story, the layers of this story that kept me going, that I knew there was so much to talk about here, from post-industrial Southern Ohio to the law, criminal malpractice, bankruptcy, to medicine, to morality, to psychology, on and on and on. There was all there in this story. And it started just with me pulling that thread of what happened to this old classmate of my dad. And, over the course of 15 years, you have a lot of book ideas, other book ideas come and go. You'll get excited about something and then it'll fizzle out. I have a whole Google Doc or folder of book ideas that never got off the ground. But this one I could never shake. It just, I couldn't walk away from it. So I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity to finally finish it. And I'm so grateful that it's found readers like you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. And I'm glad you couldn't shake it, man. I'm glad. Thanks for joining me and Phil for this conversation. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you all again in a few days.